The first punch that landed on his jaw didn't even make him blink. It was a sloppy, telegraph swing from a kid named Derek, all bluster and no technique, and it connected with the hollow thud of a fist hitting a brick wall. But the second punch, the one that sent a spray of blood from his split lip across the white tiles of the high school hallway, was different. It wasn't just a punch, it was a trigger. It was the sound of a pin being pulled from a grenade that everyone in that corridor had just assumed was a dud. The new student, a quiet, unassuming boy named Caleb, didn't fall. He didn't cry out. He just wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes turning from a placid blue to the cold, dead gray of a winter sky, and a terrifying, predator-like stillness fell over him. The bullies had picked a fight with the wrong person, but they had no idea just how deep that mistake went. If you believe in the power of second chances and the quiet strength of kindness, please hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more tales that remind us of our shared humanity. Caleb had arrived at Jefferson High School in the heart of Texas just 3 weeks prior, a ghost in a sea of boisterous teenagers. He was a paradox, a boy who moved with the coiled grace of a dancer but spoke with the hesitant murmur of someone unused to being heard. He wore plain, dark clothes that seemed designed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and his hair, a messy crop of chestnut brown, was perpetually falling over his eyes as if to shield him from the world. He was an enigma that the school's hierarchy, led by Derek and his cronies, found deeply offensive. They saw his quietness as weakness, his solitude as an open invitation for torment. The whispers started on day one. Freak, weirdo, what's he hiding? But no one, least of all Caleb, ever offered an answer. He lived with his grandmother, a woman with a spine of steel and a heart of gold, in a small, weather-beaten house on the edge of town. She was his anchor, the only person who knew the full, horrifying story of the boy he used to be. Back in Los Angeles, Caleb had been a king of a concrete jungle, the leader of the Ghosts, a gang so ruthless their name was spoken in hushed whispers. He had built his empire on fear, on the sharp glint of a blade and the cold finality of a fist. He had seen things, done things, that would haunt a normal person for 1,000 lifetimes. The blood on his hands wasn't metaphorical. It was the reason his mother couldn't look him in the eye, the reason his father had finally walked out, and the reason they had to flee in the dead of night to this dusty Texas town to start over. His grandmother had pleaded with him, her voice cracking with tears. "Caleb, you have a good heart in there. Let it beat again." For her, he had put the violence away, burying it deep beneath layers of quiet obedience and studied anonymity. He was a snake trying to shed its skin, but the patterns were still there, visible to anyone who knew how to look. The cafeteria became their hunting ground. It was a circus of noise and color, a stark contrast to Caleb's monochrome existence. He would sit alone, eating his lunch in mechanical, hurried bites, his head down. Derek and his pack would circle him like wolves, their taunts echoing off the high ceilings. "Hey loser, what's in the bag? Your lunch or your dignity?" They would sneer, knocking his tray or sending his books clattering to the floor. Caleb would just bend over, his jaw tight, and pick them up. He would apologize, his voice a flat, monotone whisper, even though it wasn't his fault. Each time, he would see his grandmother's face in his mind, a flash of her desperate hope, and he would swallow the red-hot rage that boiled in his gut. He was fighting a war within himself, a silent battle far more brutal than anything Derek could conceive. The struggle was a constant, thrumming tension in his bones, a tiger pacing in its cage, its claws scraping against the iron bars of his self-control. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks to the day since he'd arrived. The walkway leading to the science wing was half empty, the shuffle of students muffled by the drone of distant traffic. Derek was waiting, emboldened by his previous victories over the seemingly spineless new kid. He had an audience, a small crowd of onlookers who watched with a mix of excitement and unease. "Where do you think you're going, Ghost?" Derek spat, using the nickname he'd invented, unwittingly hitting far too close to home. He shoved Caleb hard, sending him stumbling back into a row of lockers with a loud clang. "You think you can just walk around here like you're invisible? You're pathetic." It was then that something in Caleb snapped. It wasn't the push or the words, but the final, mocking word. Pathetic. It was the word his father had used the last time he'd seen him. The word that had fueled a decade of misplaced anger and violence. In that moment, the carefully constructed dam of his new life shattered, and the raging river of his past came flooding back. He rose from the locker, his posture changing from a cowering slump to the erect, predatory stance of a fighter. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. His eyes, no longer quiet and blue, were twin pools of frozen fire. He didn't charge, he advanced, a slow, deliberate stalk that radiated absolute, terrifying confidence. "You don't want this," he said, his voice suddenly clear and deep, devoid of all its previous uncertainty. It was a command, not a warning. Derek, fueled by adrenaline and a false sense of security from his pack, laughed and swung the wild haymaker that drew the first blood. Caleb didn't block it. He absorbed it, letting it be the signature on his own death warrant. Derek's eyes widened in shock when his opponent didn't react. Then Caleb moved. It was a blur of motion, so fast it was almost impossible to follow. A single, brutal blow to the solar plexus folded Derek in half, the air rushing from his lungs in a pained wheeze. Another, lightning fast, broke his nose with a sickening crack. A third sent him crashing to the cold, hard floor. It took less than 5 seconds. As Derek writhed, coughing up blood and gasping for air, his friends stood frozen, their bravado evaporated. They looked at Caleb, at the ghost of a hardened killer standing in their midst, and they saw what he truly was. The quiet boy was gone, replaced by a force of nature they had foolishly provoked. The silence in the hallway was deafening. And then, Caleb looked down at his own hands, at the blood that wasn't his own. He saw the horrified faces of the other students, their eyes wide with a fear that mirrored the terror he had seen in the eyes of his victims on the streets of LA. The mask of the hardened gang leader slipped, and behind it was the face of a deeply broken boy. The rage drained out of him as quickly as it had come, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. He had lost the battle. The old Caleb had won, and in doing so, had just destroyed any chance of the new Caleb having a life here. He looked at the chaos he had wrought, at the blood on the floor, at the violent man he had just become. He had failed his grandmother. He had failed himself. A single tear traced a path through the drying blood on his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of a profound, soul-crushing shame. He didn't run away. He just stood there, his entire body trembling, waiting for the consequences. He knew they would come. He had expected punishment, expulsion, or worse. But what he didn't expect was a small, trembling hand on his own, a hand that was soft and warm and entirely unafraid. It was a girl from his English class, a quiet, studious girl named Sarah. Her eyes were filled not with fear, but with a terrible understanding. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice shaking but clear. "I saw them. I saw what they did to you." She wasn't defending his violence. She was recognizing his humanity, the pain that had driven him to it. She had read his file, understood the transfer from LA was a euphemism for running away from a past he couldn't escape. In that moment, she wasn't looking at a violent gang leader. She was looking at a scared kid who had finally been pushed too far. This act of simple, profound kindness became his lifeline. A teacher, Mr. Harrison, a man with a quiet dignity and eyes that had seen too much, didn't just call the police. He pulled Caleb aside, looked past the blood and the fury, and saw the desperate fight for redemption in his soul. He listened. He didn't judge. In the following weeks, the narrative shifted. The bullies were exposed for the cowards they were. Witnesses came forward, not to condemn Caleb for his brutal response, but to condemn the system that had allowed his torment to fester. It wasn't a clean victory. There were suspensions and meetings, and a long, painful process. But Caleb was given a chance. A real chance. He was given a new label, not gang leader, but survivor, not monster, but victim. He began to see his strength not as a weapon, but as a shield. He could have used his fists, but he chose to use his voice. He started a peer support group, a place where students who felt marginalized and alone could find a semblance of the peace he was slowly building for himself. He and Sarah, whose simple act of empathy had sparked a fire, became the heart of it. He talked about anger and how to control it. He talked about the past, without revealing all its terrifying details, but enough to show he understood the dark, lonely places where desperation lives. He found an outlet for his power in protecting the weak, not in tormenting them. The boy who was once a terrifying king was becoming a different kind of leader, one built on empathy and understanding. He began to heal, his smile becoming less of a rarity and more of a genuine reflection of a soul slowly being mended. The final chapter of this story doesn't end with a triumphant parade. It ends with a simple scene in his grandmother's garden, a month later. She was tending to her roses, humming an old hymn, and he was helping her, his hands gentle and sure with the soil. The scars on his knuckles were fading. He looked at her, this woman who had loved him through the darkest hell, and he felt a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. "I think I'm going to be okay, Grandma," he said, his voice soft but no longer hesitant. She looked up, her eyes glistening, and smiled. "I know, honey. I knew all along." The violence of his past was still a part of him, a shadow he would always carry, but it no longer defined him. He had found a new path, not by forgetting who he was, but by choosing to become something better. The fight in the hallway was a pivotal, terrifying moment. It was the explosion that had to happen. But the real victory was the silence that followed, the chance to rebuild. If this story has touched your heart and reminded you that everyone deserves a second chance, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. And I want you to do something for me, right now. In the comments below, share a time when someone showed you unexpected kindness, or a time you showed it to someone else. Let's create a community of compassion. Caleb's story is a testament to the fact that we are not defined by our worst moments, but by how we choose to rise from them. The ghosts of his past would always be there, but he had finally learned to live with them, to listen to their whispers without letting them scream. He was no longer a leader of a violent gang. He was the leader of his own heart, a boy who had found the strength to be gentle in a world that had taught him to be hard. The young man who walked through the halls of Jefferson High School that day was not the same one who had entered. He had been forged in the crucible of his own worst nightmare and had emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably stronger, and ultimately, more human. The bullies were gone, not just from the school, but from any hold they had over him. The only fight that remained was the lifelong one to stay on the path he had chosen, a path paved with the courage to be kind.